Walking a path along the roots of Pikes Peak, you take a fork in the road to the Anselm Society Digital Pub. Inside is a raucous conversation on the arts, faith, and hey, what are you doing behind that curtain? Come on out here, show yourself to everyone. In the corner, by the fire, are three people. One of them is dragging the other person from behind the curtain and out into a seat at the table. That person doing the dragging is me, Matthew Mellema, and welcome to Believe to See. We are a podcast of the Anselm Society Arts Guild. Here at Believe to See, we explore how art and storytelling matter for faith and connects our story to the great story. Because you see, here at Believe to See, we love great stories. Because great stories get to the heart of what it means to be human, which is why, everyone loves a good story. We believe that stories help us understand ourselves, understand the world, and understand God. All of the stories around us, the stories we tell, the stories we hear, and the stories we live are part of one story, the great story. So connecting story and faith, like connecting truth to goodness and beauty, can re-enchant our imaginations and open us up to the wonder of what really is. And with that, speaking of, all the ways we connect our story to the great story, let's have that person step out from behind the curtain. Okay, there you are. Okay. Within the fiction here, you're now sitting at the table. And that is our podcast new producer, manager.
Yep.
Okay.
One of those, producer, manager, something like that. Yeah, so I'm here at the table.
Okay, and your name is Jesse Childress. Jesse, welcome to the table.
Thank you. It's great to be here. I've gotten to sit here behind the curtain silently a few times. But yeah, so now I'm on this other side of the curtain now that you've dragged me out here, and here I am.
There we go. And again, listeners, Jesse is a relatively new addition to the podcast, but we are very happy to have him. He is our producer / tech liaison / brand script organizer / sort of jack of all trades with all the stuff. If you have noticed an uptick in quality, I can guarantee you it's not because of me. It is because of Jesse. So Jesse, thank you so much for actually joining us and introducing yourselves to the people. And as fate would have it, this is a topic that and especially you know a lot about. So I thought you would be particularly well equipped to introduce this topic and introduce us to our guest.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I this is definitely something that I'm very interested in, something that I love the opportunity to talk about. Probably much less knowledgeable than our guest.
Well, you gave a talk at our church about this topic.
I did, that's true. Well, my sort of background here is, I did a master's in apologetics, but with a focus on sort of like imagination and what imagination means, how that shapes the way that we see the world, how we experience things, how we experience our faith, and then how imagination connects to trauma. And sort of in that was discovering how much that relates to story, how much our imaginations are shaped by stories, and then how much our own experiences shape our own stories, shape our imaginations. And these are all just really intertwined in a way that's fascinating. I think there's a lot to talk about there, which is why our guest is here tonight with us. So joining us at the pub table tonight is Sam Jolman, who you guys are going to get to know a little bit and hear sort of from him some of why these things are important for connecting the great story to our story. So, Sam, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do, who you are?
Yeah. Well, I get to share a church community with these two gentlemen. So this is a fun place to meet outside in our virtual pub.
And again, let me assure the listeners that regardless of all the stuff you hear, you don't have to be an Anglican to listen to this podcast. You can be something else and enjoy it. But yes, we all three do attend the same Anglican church.
That's right. Maybe it helps, or maybe there's a secret language we don't know we're speaking in. But we are literally sitting at a table. We don't have to fictionalize or imagine this. So our imaginations get to rest, I suppose. Yes, I'm a father, a lover, a husband, a writer, and a therapist. So that's my day job, is being a therapist. And I get to engage people's stories of trauma and stories of life, just their human stories, all day, which is a gift.
Awesome. So first off, listeners, if you want to go back to listen to some old school Believe to See, Sam, your wife Amanda is a very talented painter, and she was actually one of our original guests to talk about her different painting techniques, which was super awesome because she studies really old Renaissance era painting techniques, and it's super fun. But as Jesse mentioned, we think this is a really interesting topic because it's not a typical story topic, but it is story adjacent, and viewing it through the lens of narrative and story, I think, sheds a lot of light on it. And Jesse mentioned this to me before we started recording, but you've done other podcasts and stuff. But it's, from what I understand, you did therapy or counseling podcasts,
right.
And you sort of added the narrative spin on it.
Right.
So now you're on a narrative podcast,
yes.
And you are adding the sort of counseling spin on it. So
yes.
We're just in the upside down here for you. But let's talk about your counseling work sort of in general. What sort of counseling work do you do? And let's, if you can, introduce how you introduce the narrative aspect to it.
Yeah, so I would consider myself a narrative-focused trauma therapist. I deal with lots of just human journey for people, but specialize in particular sexual trauma, and couples work, marriage counseling, and work for men, therapy for men. So narrative focused, meaning that I come at the topic of trauma through narrative work. Meaning how do people hold their trauma in their bodies, and just the experience of their life, their experience of relationships, and coming at that through primarily the category of narrative.
So how did you get started on doing this work through the narrative lens? Because I feel like that's not necessarily the first thing a lot of us think about when we're talking about counseling, especially for trauma like you've been discussing. So how'd you first link these two things, the narrative and the trauma?
Well, first when I was 19 years old, to tell a story, I came at counseling probably as most people do, which is something's wrong, something's not working, there's a problem of some sort, something's on fire, or maybe there's something I'm struggling with, right? There's a symptom, seemingly, that I want to fix, right? And so when I was 19, I went to a therapist for the first time, had never been to therapy, and assumed that we would sit and he would kind of solve this, or we would, fix the problem, right? And it felt really like he was a magician of some sort, in that we would talk, and in my story, my journey, he has just asked a lot of questions about my life, and I find myself in tears in these conversations with him, and had no idea how we had gotten there from where we had started with the problem to now I'm crying about things of my life, and in many ways I would leave and sit in my car for 5 to 10 minutes stunned at what just happened to me, and I remember collecting the Kleenex. It was like slowly I was getting my heart back in a certain way, and my tears back, and connecting to things inside that I felt like I had lost or had disconnected from, and it was through the avenue of story, just asking questions. So I came to it through that, and then the dream of, God, I would love to do that someday. That feels like being a magician, but I would love to be trained. And then through a series of events, followed that path to getting officially trained.
And that's interesting, because I can definitely sympathize with you in the sort of inchoate, nebulous expectations for therapy, right? It's you picture the guy with the Sigmund Freud goatee, and it's here's the problem. It's this one thing, and then you sort of hold it up to the light, and you sort of twist some other things in your brain, and then you're fine. But
right.
that did not seem. It sounds like that was not your experience at all.
Yes. Yes. It's a famous line in therapy that people ask a lot, so what do I do?
Yeah.
Right. And often, therapy is about letting something kind of unfold and reconnect in you. And often that's through journeying through stories.
Yeah. So Jesse, like I mentioned earlier, you taught a class at IAC dealing with this. So what was your first introduction to sort of combining these two things that, again, make a lot of sense together, but not obviously at first, narrative and trauma? How did you get started on that?
Yeah, I feel like it was definitely like a really slow sort of like journey where I started putting the pieces together really slowly. In my own faith, where I was seeing like I have all of these beliefs, I've had them for a long time, like I've grown up being taught these things, and so I sort of have these categories for beliefs. But then when other things sort of like assail those, the things you see in the world, the things you see in your relationships and other people, you're like, I'm not sure if I can make complete sense of these beliefs. And that's where I guess the story sort of started to come in more of saying, instead of just thinking of beliefs almost as like bullet points of like, I believe this is true, I believe this is true. Slowly starting to think in terms of like, what is the story that I believe? Like, what is the story I believe about myself? Like, what is the life I'm living? Who am I to other people? How does God factor into that? And then like, what is the story of the whole world? So where do I fit in that? But also just like, what is the whole story? Like, where did it come from? Where is it going? And that's something that is sort of bigger and helps encapsulate those bullet points of like, I believe this, I don't believe this. So has been a journey for sure in terms of seeing like more and more the importance and the value of story, how we're shaped by story as people, and like the things we choose to do or not do have so much to do about like what story we're believing, and that shapes who we are. But yeah, I think actually Sam was a part of that journey just in one of the other podcasts I heard him on, talking about these similar things. But Sam, I'd love to hear from you just, I think one of the ways that we can talk about like our faith or our faith experiences is about like believing a certain story about the whole world. So like for someone who professes Christianity, that's saying something about everything. That's saying like who God is, if there's a God, where we fit into that. The same as, if someone is a Buddhist, that says something about the way the whole world is, or anything else. An agnostic is maybe a different sort of story where it's like we don't know, but we do know that like if God's out there, he hasn't shown himself to us in ways that we can understand. So I think our faith journey says something about a story that we're believing and then we're living, and would love to hear your thoughts on how that relates to like the experiences we've had, the things that are traumatic or might be sort of like trauma adjacent. Like how do those things that is sort of your everyday relate to how we understand that whole story?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, let me start with a little bit the nature of trauma, and then I think that will give some shape to how we talk about that. I believe in a lot of ways trauma is the ending of a story for us. So, and the beginning of a new story. But at first, it doesn't feel often like a new story at all. It can feel like a nightmare, or even just sort of life goes on and I don't know the plot anymore. But trauma always ends a story. So if you think about that, if that's a divorce, right? The trauma of a divorce, there's literally a love story that's ending, that's oriented your life. Stories are how we make meaning of our lives, right? Our faith story, but also the story of our relationships, the story of our job, why we do what we do, why we hang out with who we hang out with. And so when trauma interjects in that or disrupts that, it ends some story in your life, which is the tragedy, right? It's not just that you are physically wounded or have pain, but this loss of something that oriented you and brought you meaning. So, if that's a divorce, if that's a severe car accident where suddenly you don't relate to driving the same way with a kind of freedom. I remember in my 20s going on a plane flight and having severe turbulence. And it kind of ended this relationship to flying. I used to fly and like journal, spend most of the time journaling, because it was like this idea of an adventure, right? And being in a plane and going somewhere. And for a number of years that ended, that sense of adventure. So, and that could be, take something, even as evil and traumatic as sexual harm, right? A certain way of relating to your body, a certain way of relating to a caregiver, maybe if the harm came through a caregiver, right? That there's an ending of what love to be or care to be. And for a lot of people, there's a sense of almost feeling plotless now. I don't know how to orient my life. I don't know how to make sense of that. And can lead to even an internal kind of numbness, to life, to the world. I'm going through the motions, sometimes people will say. So I would probably start there with just that understanding of the impact of trauma. And obviously then that can impact our relationship to God, meaning like, well, I thought God was there to protect me. What sense do I make of that moment that felt so absent of God or protection or care or goodness, right? Like, what does it mean to trust a God who allows this kind of thing in my life? I think those begin to shape a new story, which can feel very disorienting without intentional guidance or kind of attention to it.
Yeah, so that's an interesting way to frame it. I'd never really thought of trauma that way before, but it definitely makes sense, where it's the ending of a particular story. Or would it be fair to say it's a story or narrative that's sort of being proven false? Like even implicit narratives, like the narrative like, when I'm driving on the road, I'm safe, or this marriage that I'm in is strong, or this person who was caring for me is trustworthy. Like that, it's also revealing a false narrative. Is that a decent way to look at it?
Yeah, my only caution is that, and that is that oftentimes I think the voice of evil comes to people to try to narrate those moments to them as a counter voice to say, you were a fool. How could you have trusted them? Right? You got it wrong. So I wouldn't go quite that far, but maybe what we could say is apparently the world is a far different place than I knew. And what story, right? What does healing look like? Well, it means being able to find a story that can hold this. Right? Like, my understanding of my faith has to now contain this story. Like, I have to be able to orient to this story with a new story, right? Yeah. And maybe a more real story, right? Or a story that I caution. I'm just holding back. Obviously, you're hearing me hold back from that word false, because it can often be how evil comes to say you were a fool, and I don't think that's true. But maybe there's more going on than I knew. Might be a way to say it.
Okay. Yeah. And then you sort of again, to go to the story terms, I'm almost thinking through like the story lens where, it's a classic story trope where it's like the person who wakes up suddenly and they don't know where they are.
Yes.
They're in like another world apparently with rules that they don't understand, and that like that's how the story gets going, right?
Yes. Yeah. Right. Often, right. Stories begin when things go wrong.
Yeah.
Right?
Exactly.
And so to some degree, that's the joy of my work, is being able to engage people in how they walk through their pain, or pursue life or goodness, or these deeper virtues or deeper values, like to find this deeper story. What am I doing now? What's the plot?
Yeah, as I'm hearing you guys talk about these things, I'm thinking of two things. One of like how do all these things relate to like our faith experiences, and then for like me in particular, like how does this relate to like what I've believed in my life, and how those things have shifted. And Sam, you just said something like that's how a story begins, is when something goes wrong. Matt, you said that as well. It's like there's some cataclysmic moment that makes the story start. And my mind immediately went to thinking of like our faith journeys in that way, of like something happens that maybe gets it started, maybe when we thought it was already like going the whole time. And like thinking of my own experience, sort of kind of growing up with less of a story focus, more of a doctrine focus of like, these are the things that we believe, and these are the things that are safe to believe, and we need to stay sort of right here because they're good and they're safe and they're true. And so it's like there's the big story, it's the Christian story, and then you just need whatever your experience is, it just needs to fit in there well. But I think like what I'm hearing you say when you talk about trauma, Sam, is like trauma are the things that happen that don't fit with whatever story we have. Mm-hmm. They end a story, they break a narrative, they break a current understanding of the way that we see the world. And so that seems to have really interesting implications for like what is our faith story. And like that faith story needs to be able to like hold all of those stories that are our own stories, those things that are confusing and don't make sense, as opposed to what I think I sort of have felt that I was supposed to do and believe growing up, which was just like whatever my stories are, whatever doesn't make sense, I just need to somehow like shove that into the big story and make sure it fits and make sure it's safe, and anything that doesn't, like I don't need to consider that as real or important. Because the only story that matters is like the great story, God's story. And my stories, if they don't fit that, they're not right. Mm-hmm. But I think maybe there's more of like, both of those stories are informing each other, because you're saying the story ends, but maybe another story is the beginning. Mm-hmm. And maybe that shifts the narrative of how you're thinking about those things.
Yeah, and I relate with that sense, of having grown up with a faith that had to fit a story, right? And that sense almost of like, I can't wrestle over here with where it doesn't fit. And yet, my goodness, we have these really rich texts in the Bible of people wrestling out parts of their story. David, Jeremiah and Lamentations, literally, there's a section in Lamentations where Jeremiah does a reverse Psalm 23, right? He's literally, it's like an epic takedown of God, of like nothing of Psalm 23 has felt true. And, there's a place he says, you fed me with gravel and made me bitter. I can't remember all the connections, but here's Jeremiah obviously wrestling with something that's on, this doesn't fit. I don't know what to do with you, God. And I think there's something kind about being able to honor the parts of our story that don't feel like they fit. And staying open to God, like, what story are you writing now?
Yeah, and I think the way that we go about that is important too, because going back to what Jesse was saying, I think a lot of folks who grow up in the Christian faith, it's very easy, even without necessarily meaning to think that the Christian faith it's like a series of bullet points that you have to intellectually accept. Like, here, I accept this proposition, this proposition, this proposition. But this is very obvious, but something we forget a lot. That's not how the Bible's constructed. It's not just like, all right, here's the divine bullet points, believe these and you're cool. Like, they're told in stories, they're told in poetry, they're told in songs. It would have been very easy for Jeremiah and Lamentations to be like, to just have your 5 bullet points to take away, but he didn't. He wrote a poem. Something similar, Flannery O'Connor had this quip, this might be apocryphal, but whatever, where someone was asking her what one of her stories was about. And she's like, if I could tell you what the story's about in a sentence, I wouldn't have written the story, I would have just told you the sentence. So it seems like there's similar things here where it goes beyond the factual the factual statements and something beyond that.
Right. I think another reason why I'm a narrative therapist, because I think stories are containers of meaning. Mm-hmm. It's how we contain anything that's meaningful to us. That's how we talk about it, right? If I ask you about your life, eventually you're going to get into stories about your life, like how was your weekend? Good. And if I ask the second or the third question, we're eventually going to be into stories about your weekend. Mm-hmm. What did you do? What was good? Right? Well, let me tell you. Or, tell me about your wife. Mm-hmm. Where did you meet? Right? Like eventually, tell me about your family. What do you do? Anything that matters to us, we eventually hold them, the meaning of them, or the significance of them in stories. So similar, I would agree, this idea of a system or an assenting to a certain, list of tenets, right? Like it doesn't hold that that richness, nor is it probably how any of us would tell our faith story, right? Like, how did you come to God?
Well, I accepted the following propositions. I sat in a corner and thought and realized, yes, I do assent.
Yeah, that's how it always works.
That's right. That's so enthralling.
Yeah. Sam, I did want to ask you, you mentioned just all these like different stories a person can tell, and like thinking of like, if I think about what happened last weekend, suddenly like what I'm doing, I'm accessing memories in order to tell you a story. And one of the theme for the month of August for the Anselm Society in general is memory. And I'm really curious to hear your thoughts in terms of like, especially when we're talking about our stories and maybe how we have experienced things, even how we've experienced God in the past. And maybe sometimes those don't even match up, it's like my memory of what God has been like and what he's like now, they're not the same. But regardless, anytime that we're accessing meaning through our own story, we're doing that through memory. So I'd love to hear you talk just about like, what is the significance of memory and story, and how does that relate to something like trauma and the ways that those things have shaped us?
Yeah, great. I would love, at the end of what I say, to hear, because you've studied imagination, so I would love to hear you talk about the connection between imagination and memory too. But let me just maybe share a little about the nature of memory. When you remember something, you actually visualize it, right? And then what you visualize is what you talk about. So nobody sees a running scroll of words of a story. In other words, when you recall something, you relive it. So literally the dendrite connections, right? The neurons in your brain that contain that story get activated again. And not just the visual, but all the sensory experience of that memory comes back to you. And then you tell people what you're seeing in your head. So the cool part about that related to trauma, so trauma fragments, meaning it splits all that up, and so it doesn't hold together in a cohesive way. You might have a flash of sensation. I've had people have flashbacks, smell flashbacks, or touch flashbacks, meaning like this feels so disconnected, but then it triggers a visual flash, right? And so trauma bifurcates. But as you start to recall, and you're kind with yourself, as you recall, the memory actually opens up to be remade. So when you tell a story of your life, based on how the hearers receive it, that memory changes. Now, the facts don't change, but your experience of it changes. So if you tell a story of your life and people grieve with you, oh my goodness, you will now encode with that memory their kindness and their care for you. And there will be a new felt sense of that memory. So our memory of life actually can change over time. Now again, do the facts change of the event? No. But the meaning of it can change to you It's why I have a job. So when I sit with people, if we're able to sit with a story with kindness, it actually changes the experience of the memory, and can bring that healing. And those fragmented parts can be brought together, and we can create a beginning, a middle, and an end to an event, and with kindness honor the pain of it. So that's how I even have a job as a therapist, is we get to do that. I joke, it's a little like non-invasive brain surgery, in that we're actually moving dendrites and creating different connection. So I'd love to hear from you how memory relates to imagination, given that you've studied imagination. I know I'm kind of putting you on the spot.
Well,
with that.
sure. Actually, while you are formulating your answer, Jesse, I was thinking about what you just said, and it got me thinking about how I come at memory from different perspectives, just because I deal with memory a lot, but not in that particular way. Where one of the ways I deal with memory is, I'm an attorney, so one of the things I talk about to people a lot, I will depose them or, cross-examine them about things that happened in the past. And people who do this very swiftly realize people's memories of past events aren't always super accurate.
Yeah.
And it's totally natural. It's people who believe they're telling the truth, but the way they go back to think about these memories, and even if they're, sometimes they're very traumatic, a serious car accident or some sort of, other trauma. Other times they're not terribly traumatic. They're a minor car accident. But the way that you go back and look at it can be shaped by what other people tell you, by the way a question's framed, by just going back and remembering it. You can almost break down the word. You're recollecting it again, and that can really change. And it's just fascinating. It's just for me as an attorney, I've just learned to be very gentle with people when they misremember things. You don't just they're lying. They're just misremembering it. Whatever.
Yeah.
And another thing related to that is I have in the past dabbled in being a memoir writer, which again it's all memory. It's taking these memories in sort of molding them into a story arc or a narrative. And you get to realize how fluid memory can be,
yes.
which can be used for good or ill in the memoir department. You just talked about, Sam, how you can use this sort of plasticity of memory for good.
Yes. Right.
And that just, again, that's sort of an implication of memory that I had not really thought of sufficiently, but it's so interesting. And now that I've given my thoughts, Jesse, you can give your thoughts about imagination's role here.
Yeah, no, I think I like, Matt, that you brought up that memory is not something to be trusted to the utmost degree. And I like, one of the things I'm imagining is the way that our total perceptions of people can change. Maybe something happened, and maybe we didn't think much of it at the time. Maybe somebody else brings it up to us, and it's did you notice they said that to you or did that to you? And maybe I didn't notice. But then I think about it, and I think about it 4 or 5 different times, and it's slowly the memory changes where I'm I can't believe them. And I
How
think
dare they?
Yeah, and at the time that it happened, I didn't think anything of it. And I think maybe in some way that's similar, Sam, to what you're describing. You can reshape those in a positive way rather than a negative way.
Right. And I think there is a need to accept that memory is impressionistic.
Mm-hmm.
It's like an impressionistic painting.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just literally what was, right? But
Mm-hmm.
It's also my feeling about it,
Mm-hmm.
right? And my sense of it. And it's not to say, I'm dealing with it in a therapy office, right?
Yeah.
You're dealing with it on a in the court of law, but there is a need to trust. Maybe not just this as a factual account of this happened, then this happened, then this happened, but to trust the meaning that it holds for you. So you may remember, oh my goodness, they were yelling at you. No, they weren't, right? But it felt like they were yelling. Okay, well, let's talk about why it felt like that, right? And again, even there is some meaning. So you may not be able to trust it, factually as a data account, but the meaning, again, is what matters most. And I would even say, just to add, trauma is not simply about the facts, right? Of like, how tragic was it? Well, how much blood? How big was the accident, right? It's what meaning was made. When I brought up that story of the plane flight, my brother-in-law was on that same plane flight where I had a panic attack because of some turbulence. He put his hands up like he was on a roller coaster and thought it was hilarious. And here I was having a panic attack from the same event, right? Well, what do we do with that? Well, again, it's the meaning that's made, the experience of it. That needs to be honored in that.
Yeah.
So there's a trustworthiness, but it's the trusting that there's the sensation it gave you, the meaning it gave you.
The meaning that's happening. Yeah, that makes sense. I think I'm thinking back to when you were describing memory a few minutes ago as sort of like a visual impression from which we create a story. And I think that's such a good sort of shifting to talk about imagination and like what is the imagination and what is the importance of it for like who we are, what our faith is, how we live our lives. I think that's such a good sort of description of why, like, humans as story beings, people who are sort of shaped by the stories that they're living and hearing, because like nobody in their imagination sees a list of bullet points for anything unless they're imagining like a list of bullet points. They don't see the list of bullet points. So like we sort of, our imaginations are sort of the thing that hits first when we're thinking about something. One of the ways that this could be thought of is sort of like from the brain science or the counseling direction, and those people usually use different language than the sort of like imagination, but the idea that like you're experiencing things in your body and in your sort of like subconscious, your limbic system, before you're like making sense of those with your executive function, before you're saying this means this is what I'm going to do, this makes sense, and I can sort of rationalize it all. Before any of that happens, your body and your limbic system have reacted to those things and told you something about them. And that in some way correlates to what we're talking about as imagination. So like maybe talk about like your imagination, the way that you imagine God is not necessarily the exact same as like what you believe about God. So powerful. you can say maybe with like the way that you believe about God, like I believe that God's good, I believe God's a father, I believe that he's trustworthy. But if like somebody starts talking about God and you feel these other things happening in your body or like in the way that you're feeling about things, where your mind goes, where your imagination goes, the things that you're thinking about, and it's not a God who's good, it's not a God who's trustworthy. That's maybe the sort of the imagination side of it, of like there's a story there that for some reason like you have these, you have your bullet points, and then you have this story. For some reason, they don't match up. One of the things that comes to my mind, and one of the things that was part of sort of what I was exploring when I studied this, was some of C.S. Lewis's writings. And so one of the things that really stuck out was A Grief Observed. So his sort of, it's his journal, basically, from when his wife dies. Some people will argue that that's sort of like a posturing, that like C.S. Lewis was a very like famously private person and didn't let people see into his life a lot. So some people will say that that's a quasi work of like fiction and autobiography in one, where he's creating this sort of experience and this picture of like what it looks like to go through grief or to go through trauma, and what that does to like the way you see God and what you think about God. Because if you were to read A Grief Observed and not know who it was written by, you wouldn't necessarily know that that was somebody who held the beliefs that C.S. Lewis believed and had argued for, and had written stories, written like apologetic works, all these other things. But so A Grief Observed is sort of a work of imagination, in the sense that he's talking about these sort of like visual experiences, these ways that what's happened to him has shaped the way that he's feeling and thinking about and experiencing God, as someone who's not good, as someone who's going to play a trick on him rather than offer him a good gift. So I think there's those really interesting ways where memory and imagination and our own experiences sort of collide with story. And all of those, you can connect them to the big story and say, like, who was God through all of this, or what had C.S. Lewis experienced up to this point. But yeah, there's so many connections there.
Yeah, so there's a couple levels there that I thought are interesting. One was, this difference between, if I'm understanding what you all are saying correctly, correct me if I'm wrong, that the trauma isn't just like the facts, like the things that happen to you. It's that plus the way your body, your brain, your mind respond to it. And that can be very different from different people. Like I'm thinking, much more petty examples than like serious trauma, just like daily things. Like there'll be times when me and my wife have an interaction with another person and we leave the interaction and my wife will look to me like, weren't you just completely offended? Like, that was awful what just happened. And I'm like, what was it? Like, it just sort of washes over me. But there are other things that'll happen where it just washes over my wife, but because of me and, like my anxieties, my history, and all stuff, it'll just be devastating. Just like it hits my brain, goes through all the little neurons, it hits all the anxiety lobes or whatever they are, and it's catastrophic. Just the way different facts can hit different people so differently. And then related to that, like what you brought up, Jesse, with the bullet points versus what your narrative reveals, and that really strikes me a lot. Where there's my bullet points, and I have my bullet points, but when I look at the way I live my life in some regards, like, am I living as if those bullet points are actually true, or do I have this other narrative stuff there? And Sam, I am guessing these are the sort of things you will be discussing with your patients. Am I guessing correctly?
Yeah, and Jesse, I was resonating to connect that with what you described as like the limbic experience, right? So, which is one understanding of the brain, the triune brain, the neocortex, the limbic, and the reptilian parts of the brain. The limbic is the feeling center of the brain. And it's true that experience comes to us through sensation, and then meaning is made of that sensation. So, when I sit with clients, we're often dealing with, when we're engaging trauma, the haunting and terrifying part of trauma is that it comes back to you seemingly out of the blue through the body, often through sensation, like a panic attack or anger or just sensation in your body where you can feel even not at home in your own body, your own felt experience, or you feel disconnected or numb and I don't know what's happening right now, right? And so trying to then be curious about that. But obviously along the way, some of the worst part of trauma is that few people get the care they need after the trauma. And so they're kind of left to cope with it in a certain way, right? Like you think of childhood trauma that literally goes unspoken. And so all of that experience is suppressed and held in the body. And yes, we have to find ways to cope, right? How do I cope now? And that's often the stuff that brings people in, is the way of coping doesn't work anymore. So like, I'm drinking way too much. What do I do? I don't know why. I just know I need to stop, right? And how do I fix it, right? Yeah. And the difficulty is helping them understand, well, part of fixing it is actually tuning in to something. It's not just getting rid of the behavior, or my wife and I fight all the time, or I've had an affair, or I'm looking at pornography, right? And being able to say, well, we're not just going to stop what you're doing, because that would lead you with like something that's uncopable, right, in your life. Like, we're also going to ask questions of what that's functioned for you. What is that there for? How did you get there? Because there's meaning. And this is the beautiful thing about how God made us. Even our addictions, even our ways of coping, have symbolism in it. And so being able to kind of work that back into stories, there's like these clues you can follow back into a story. So yeah, we deal with what has that helped you cope with, and then that takes you into story.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think like in one of the interesting and helpful things about this is it will help people dealing with, the serious trauma like you're dealing with, and even like the more daily trauma, is that a word where
Right.
where it's like, because I know for me, just knowing certain facts about myself is I'm given to, in certain situations, like a lot of people feel inordinate anxiety in certain situations, where one of the things that someone pointed out to me and I found very helpful was just realizing I'm not a logic robot, I'm a human. And because I'm a human, sometimes my brain pumps all that adrenaline into my body without a good reason for it. So when I'm feeling the anxiety, it's not like, oh no, I need to reason my way out of it. I must not have prayed sincerely enough. It's, oh, weird, my body's pumping too much adrenaline. Okay, and then you just sort of take that fact and deal with it.
So, Matt, you say take that fact and deal with it, but that's funny because it's also like you're taking a whole story about you versus you being a logic robot or you being like an actual human being, and like it's a whole story of how you see yourself, not just like not just a fact. But
yeah. So, but it's also like the situation I find myself in. So here's the story. I am a human being whose heart is racing because his brain's pumping when it shouldn't be, or something like that. It's different from, I must,
I'm a robot who's malfunctioning.
I'm a malfunctioning robot.
I need a tune-up.
Right. So instead of seeing it as a problem,
Yeah.
right, and in some ways it could be a problem, right? Like I have too much anxiety, right? Like, but also seeing it as like a clue.
Yeah.
Like, what story is my brain? What am I living? What is my brain preparing for? Right? Like, I'm anxious. What is my brain sensing is going to happen? Right? Like stories are also how we predict the future. Right? Like,
how we imagine a future.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we're running low on time for this. So I think maybe a decent way to close on this. So, if someone's dealing with serious trauma, I'm guessing your advice would be like go get help, go talk to someone, go find that. But let's say someone's dealing with again, the daily trauma.
Right.
What are some good, just practical first steps they can do to sort of reorient their story to deal with the daily trauma of being a human being?
And if I could add on to that.
Producer piggybacking onto my final question.
I do, I know.
Okay.
But so same question, but maybe also focusing in for maybe at least part of the answer, that idea of what do you do to make sense of those stories when it's your story and maybe your faith story, and you want those to make sense together. You want to be invested in that, but it just doesn't make sense, and you can't reconcile this is who I am or what I've experienced, and this is what I think I'm supposed to believe.
Yeah. Well, I think just a deep commitment to kindness to your own felt experience of life. So, taking your experience of an event or traffic or your boss or, something you're going through, your kids, being able to pause and give yourself the kindness of this isn't just something I need to stop or get rid of. It's something I need to be curious about. So I think that's an act of kindness to yourself to say maybe there's more to what's going on here. Maybe I'm getting frustrated for a reason, or there's meaning I need to tune into there. I think as well, just man, there are so many competing stories, for our lives, and so soaking in good stories, I think, is an act of kindness. Read good fiction, and I think there's something about that can be shaping to, just trusting. There's plot even when you don't see plot, or trusting there's more to the story even, because you can see that in these other characters' lives, and so I think just an act of soaking in fiction, that's been something I've been doing, just working through the toll of the pandemic even has been just trying to get into fictional stories to that's been healing, and I think as far as faith, sometimes just reading your Bible, not to try to get anything out of it, but just reading it. I think I got this from N.T. Wright, where he talks about like, reading the Bible isn't just about trying to, get the point, but just soaking in it, right? Just letting it soak and be like, I don't know why that story's in there, but okay. I read it, right? And just letting stories work on you the way stories do, right? They come back to you later when you're like, oh wow, okay. Like there's a shaping nature to story, just letting it marinate you limbically, maybe we could say. And then not trying to force, I need to fit. I need to believe God is good. Well, you can assent to it and also wrestle with it at the same time. Like as you said so well.
Awesome. So, Jesse, since you are the producer, I do feel like the way the hierarchy works is I am entitled to give you the chance at the last word before my closing.
I thought you were going to make me do the closing, and I was like,
that's a great idea.
No, don't make me do it. Not this time. I'm not sure I would do it right. I just want to say thanks, Sam, so much for being on the podcast. And
absolutely.
I wish we'd had more of a chance to dive in with you on that last thing you said about soaking in great fiction, because there's so much good meat there in terms of we're talking about our stories, we're talking about the great story, but we didn't get to the great stories part. And it's because that's its own piece, and we could talk about that. How does that shape us in our lives, just to really be immersed in great stories and great fiction. But thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. It's been really fun.
Absolutely, thank you. And as y'all can probably tell, things are winding down at the Anselm Society Digital Pub. The fire's down to embers, the customers are trundling home, and you've polished off your final glass. Once again, Believe to See is a podcast of the Anselm Society Arts Guild. To find out more about the Anselm Society, please visit us at anselmsociety.org. And while you're at it, why not rate and review the show at iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And really quick, we meant to mention this during the podcast, so I'll just mention it now. Sam Jolman actually has a free ebook that is available on his website, samjolman.com. The name of that ebook is Storyformed, and as its subtitle says, it's designed to help you recover the self you lost once upon a time. So basically it goes into a lot of the themes that we discussed in the episode, but just dives into them more deeply. So if you're interested in exploring this subject more fully, please go to samjolman.com and check out his free ebook, Storyformed. Once again, thank you so much for listening to Believe to See, and we'll catch you next time.